Welcome to the Tank Podcast. I'm Tina, Tank's full-time voiceover artist. In this episode, I will be reading from Joe Kennedy's Green and Unpleasant Land, taken from Ruritania, the spring 2019 issue of Tank. Autumn is almost spent and I'm high on the grouse moors that form the watershed between the individual valleys of the Yorkshire Dales. This is the region where my family live and I spent my childhood, and to which I return from time to time for a break from the bustle and backbiting of the metropolitan southeast. At 3 in the afternoon, the sun has been cut out by both cloud and the shoulder of a hill, and a recent chilly shower has topped up the ruts in a dirt track running up a ledge above a swift, narrow beck that leads to some derelict lead workings. Still, there's enough light to perceive foxy streaks in the otherwise browned-out heather and fern, and to make out the villages of Swaledale below, each plotted linearly along the road to the same pub-church cottages arrangement. This place appears to have held itself in stasis as I have aged, changed, travelled, pestered for work, adopted technologies, been buffeted by the political currents. Yet, at the same time, I know that this sense of predictable stability is itself vexed by the political. We don't access harmony and grace without incurring some form of cost, even if it's not a personal one. Whether in the form of the idyllic, jolly, middle-class pastoral, or a grittier model of provincial authenticity or non-urban disquiet, the rural abrades any progressive account of where Britain might end up in 5, 10, 50 years. What am I subscribing to when I huff that lungful of Yorkshire air and declare myself to be at ease, to finally be myself, my feet back on the proverbial home soil? Is this nothing more than petty, nostalgic self-indulgence? An unwarranted and craven retreat from urgently pressing matters that insist upon unwavering rigor and solidarity rather than solipsistic mindfulness? Can the left ever get mud on its boots? There's a backstory to this question. As New Labour thrashed and withered in the late noughties, constipating itself over the financial crisis and a perceived lack of deference to racists in Rochdale, David Cameron smartly picked out the environment as the safest juice cleanse for the previously toxic Conservative Party. This didn't necessarily entail any meaningful environmental commitment, merely an aesthetic investment in the countryside symbolised in an updated party logo, best described as an amicable tree, a dumbed-down, twee reimagining of the oak used by Edmund Burke as an icon of English conservatism in reflections on the revolution in France at the end of the 18th century. For all its superficiality, this rebrand was important because it resonated with a broader cultural interest in a mythic deep, largely non-urban Englishness which began to stir about 4 or 5 years after the millennium. Beginning in 2004 or so, a green-fingered Anglocentrism, a nominally progressive patriotism of Eric Ravilius Prince and Great British Grub began to nudge aside the trappings of a slickly tedious third-way modernity. Here was Peter Ackroyd's voluminous, breathless book Albion, The Origins of the English Imagination, published in 2002, an expansive celebration of the intangible melancholy sown into the land. Here was the menu of a pub that had ditched the Thai green curries and salmon tagliatelle for bangers and mash, line-caught haddock and a cheeseboard sourced within a tight 15-mile radius. One could put this ascendant preoccupation with rootedness down to a gathering post-millennial technophobia, but it also seemed to offer more substantial fare when compared to the dominant pop cultural scenery of mid-period New Labour, chipper songs about Sven-Göran Eriksson, a millionth series of Big Brother, the dog end of UK Garage, someone chewing your ear off about full moon parties on the other side of the world. By the time the 2010 general election came around, the folk kitsch mood had become preeminent. With predictable irony, this was most pronounced in London, which at times appeared to have undergone a wholesale makeover by Cath Kidston. Advertising agencies churned out phone commercials soundtracked by carefully careless acoustic strumming, turnip farmer beards sprouted in Canary Wharf offices, microbreweries started turning out demonstratively rustic winter ales from arches beneath the overground. Laid end to end, The capital's allotment waiting lists would have stretched beyond the M25. As has often been the case, an imagined version of the countryside, real farmers are, by and large, far too busy to tinkle away on mandolins, had budged aside the real one. One might say that this hackneyed idealism was simply a trite updating of the paintings commissioned by landowners during the enclosures of the Georgian period, promoting the idea that the privatization of the land was benevolent, natural and necessary. Every smoothie ad showing the sun descending over a wooded vale was, in its own way, an after-image of Thomas Gainsborough's infamous Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, 1750. As Owen Hatherley pointed out in his 2016 work, The Ministry of Nostalgia, this pivot towards the bucolic, and the complementary idea of horticultural and culinary self-reliance, was a perfect fit for a political economy that insisted on austerity. In 2011, as much of inner London was convulsed by riots sparked by the killing of Mark Duggan, but fueled by racialized economic and infrastructural neglect, Cameron was photographed in a moment of chummy banter with Alex James, the cheese-making former Blur bassist, at the latter's food festival in the Cotswolds. The image and its suppressed context summed up a Britain in which a pastoral dream of sunny haymaking was plastered over deep-rooted inequalities in an act of particularly spurious reality management. Reaching all the way back to its origins in ancient Greece, the pastoral has always lent towards the conservative. Roman poets such as Virgil, in his eclogues of the 1st century BCE, reached for the mode to conceive of a realm beyond the drear sniping of politics, a zone of fixity in which time was suspended and robust common sense threw the machinations of urban life into stark, unforgiving relief. If politics is broadly about the competition between different visions of the future, the pastoral implicitly mocks progressive beliefs with its suggestion that the deep truth of things will be immutable regardless of efforts at betterment, whether those are revolutionary or gradualist. Trying to effect egalitarian change flies in the face of nature's inclination towards predictable cycles. We should be grateful for what we have. Consequently, the pastoral also avows its own apoliticism. It claims to represent life at a level of uncontested, matter-of-fact simplicity, in vignettes that subtract politics as the best means of decluttering the world. While obviously banal in comparison to Virgil or various luminaries of the English pastoral tradition from Edmund Spenser and Ben Jonson to Rupert Brooke, the Cameron-era culture industry offers up a plethora of easily identifiable examples of this aspiration to simplification, from the Great British Bake Off's marquee, spattered invariably in gentle rain, to the still flourishing publishing trend which fills the market with what seems like thousands of books every year on badgers, hedges, newts and wild swimming. Taken in isolation, these titles are harmless enough, and in some cases raise crucial ecological questions in good faith. Cumulatively, they can feel like a blanket denial of the political in favor of a more sturdily grounded way of life, a discourse that exhorts its readers to zoom in on the meadow flowers between their feet rather than adopt critical perspectives on the socio-economic norm. As such, it's a pastoral vision which appears to offer a vindication of the locally specific as opposed to the nebulously, sterilely global. In practice, however, this localism is often less specific than it affects to be and diffuses into a vague, awkward patriotism, which explains its amenability to the buxom Anglian joviality of coalition-era Toryism. Pastoral's nostalgia and traditionalism, and its elaborately detailed but rose-tinted renditions of the uncomplex life, have historically been anathema to the left. This has certainly been the case in the 8 years since Cameron huzzared his way into Downing Street, with a variety of critics, and I've been one of them, publishing polemical takedowns of this industry in feel-good rurality. One way in which resistance to postmillennial pastoral has been expressed is through an attachment to a counter-pastoral that seeks out a menacing, unhospitable version of the countryside. In 2015, Robert Macfarlane, unofficial laureate of the new topographical non-fiction, and totem for a new generation of nature writers whose breezy paeans to woodcraft had come to dominate Waterstones, published a lengthy and, at the time, iconoclastic, article in The Guardian arguing for the political urgency of puncturing the bake-off idyll. In this compendious piece of work, he offered a genealogy of an English eyrie stretching back to the 19th century and beyond, encompassing the ghost stories of M.R. James, the more authentically weird realm of the folk music tradition, the children's fiction of Alan Garner and the woozy atrocities of Ben Wheatley's 2013 film A Field in England, among much else. These were works, McFarlane said, that permitted a glimpse of the skull beneath the skin of the countryside, the brutality, inequality, poverty and unremitting toil that had shaped the English landscape and that the pastoral tends to find inadmissible. The haunted terrain of James's fiction or Wheatley's psychedelic violence are in this reading regarded as metaphors for all the knotty social relations that are kept out of prettified accounts. The lead workings above Swaledale would be a typical site of this counter-pastoral, perhaps. People preface beauty with ravaged to describe this landscape, and not only because of the jagged sculpting effects of upland weather on limestone. With a little prodding, it becomes clear that this is anything but a natural environment. Even the undulant sweep of the Grousemoor has been shaped by millennia of human usage, and a well of uneasy queries is sprung. Who worked these mines centuries ago? Were they comfortable, safe and well paid? How long could they expect to live? In what ways does the work they did then continue to impact upon the environment? Those sheep, again, a less natural part of the regional ecology than they initially appear, now huddle photogenically at the base of the flues in the old smelting huts. It's not that hard to imagine that this was once a grim, oppressive place. Identifying that England's countryside might not be quite so benevolent as the green Tory aesthetic wants us to think has been a good business to be in since McFarlane's essay. Cop shows centered on the rottenness that can nestle within the most gorgeous scenery, Broadchurch, Happy Valley, Shetland and so on, have been to a penny ever since reviewers started praising the first of these for getting beyond the cozy clichés of, say, Midsummer Murders. There's a whole cottage industry in so-called folk horror, literature, film, TV and even music which looks back to the improvised out-of-town frights of Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape and the BBC's A Ghost Story for Christmas series. Authors like Paul Kingsnorth in The Wake, 2014, and Benjamin Myers in Beastings, 2014, and The Gallows Pole, 2017, have specialized in tales of olden days deep country thuggery that rehash how hedgerows and hollows can conceal the bloodiest of deeds. In fact, there's as much counter-pastoral about nowadays as there is pastoral. McFarlane's assertion that a sort of death metal version of the non-urban might intimidate Tories off their land has been rather strained by the sudden ubiquity of creepy trees, spirit-worried marshes and copses of criminality. On the one hand, the counter-pastoral has been winnowed down to a series of easily imitable and therefore commodifiable tropes, but this isn't exactly the biggest shortcoming of its popularization. That would be the way in which the understated menace of the countryside has itself been presented as an eternal truth outside all political ministrations in a way that is strikingly, if negatively, similar to cream tea idealization. There is something fatalistic and acquiescent about the notion that the entirety of the nation outside the M25 is a thrillingly edgy straw dog scape. It marks provincial England out as somehow inevitably fallen and unmodern, and therefore beyond help. There's more. The pastoral emerged as a buttered-up dream about the superiority of the unambitious life beyond the polis, but that was in an era when one could at least safely say where the polis began and ended. This is hardly the case now. Of course, there's a sign on the motorway that announces the end of London, but the contemporary city is merely the architectural concentration on line infinity. When we examine the counter-pastoral's fixation with the gritty truth of the old-fashioned countryside, what we may really be witnessing is anti-digital fantasy, a mangled yearning for a place out with the ceaseless conversation and unbounded opinionating the internet not only permits but insists upon. What emerged as an understandable response to the manipulative deceit of false folk has arguably become its part and mirror image. Some modern attempts to philosophize the environment, specifically deep ecology, which demands that we think of nature apart from otiose human conceptions of nature, are hardly out of step with some of the more nihilistic, misanthropic trends in modern conservatism. How, then, might the left engage with the question of the countryside without purposefully excluding the present? There are no easy answers here, but it's worth thinking about a significant moment in the history of the relationship between British socialism and rural England. In 1932, 400 or so left-leaning ramblers trespassed onto Kinder's Scout in the Derbyshire Peak District to protest the manner in which land law excluded the working and lower middle classes from some of the nation's most spectacular wild country. Though a number were arrested, the long-term effects of the mass trespass remain with us in the form of national parks and much more expansive, though hardly exhaustive, rights of access. Rather than wishfully positioning the countryside outside of political modernity, it insisted on the opposite, on democratizing and even socializing the outdoors. Many nature lovers are snooty about the kind of online naturalism which expresses itself in, say, Instagram posts of snow-dusted forests or charismatic rock formations, but does a similar utopian impulse to the one which drove the trespassing protest, a desire to share and thus to privatize the experience of nature, lie buried in this nook of social media. In any case, it seems dangerous to cede everything outside cities to this variously optimistic and doom-laden species of native traditionalism. The challenge that confronts the left is to find a way of stitching the non-urban local to a collective vision that exceeds the narrow horizons of nostalgic nationalism. To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.